You know the songs, you've heard the name, but how well do you really know Bob Dylan? Behind the Nobel Prize, the protest anthems, and the ever-changing persona lies a man who spent his entire life running from expectations, from labels, even from himself. At 82, he survived more reinventions, controversies, and quiet disappearances than most artists could even imagine. And while millions sing along to Like a Rolling Stone or Blowin' in the Wind, few realize the true depth of the pain, the mystery, and the contradiction behind that voice. Because Dylan's story isn't just one of musical brilliance, it's a life marked by lost loves, spiritual awakenings, shattered illusions, and one motorcycle crash that may or may not have changed everything. His journey isn't clean, it's messy, complicated, and often heartbreaking. So, if you think Bob Dylan is just a legendary songwriter, buckle up. We're diving deep into a story far more raw and far more revealing than any lyrics could ever tell. Before he became a myth, Bob Dylan was just a boy with a beat-up guitar and a desperate need to be heard. Born as Robert Allen Zimmerman on May 24, 1941 in Duluth, Minnesota, he was raised in the iron mining town of Hibbing, a quiet, frozen corner of the world that felt a million miles away from fame. His parents, Abram and Beatrice, ran a small appliance shop. They were part of a tight-knit Jewish community, shaped by immigration, survival, and tradition. But even then, Dylan was looking for something else, something louder. He was obsessed with the radio, not the safe, polished broadcasts, but the wild, untamed rhythms of blues and soul drifting up from faraway southern stations. He stayed up late, twisting dials, chasing voices, melodies that didn't belong in small-town Minnesota. He wasn't just listening, he was studying. By high school, Dylan had formed a string of local bands, blasting out Little Richard and Elvis covers with a raw energy that shocked his teachers and got his mic cut off mid-performance. He called one of them the Golden Chords, but there was nothing golden or polished about them. They were loud, rebellious, and already Dylan was showing signs of the defiance that would define his life. But even rock and roll wasn't enough. Dylan started drifting toward folk music. Not because it was popular, it wasn't, but because it had depth. It was dark, honest, and full of stories that felt more real than anything he saw around him. Folk wasn't about showmanship, it was about truth. In 1959, after graduating from Hibbing High, Dylan moved to Minneapolis to attend the University of Minnesota. But books couldn't compete with guitars. He spent more time at local cafes than in class, hanging around the 10 o'clock Scholar Coffee House, soaking in the scene and sharpening his craft. It was here he first started calling himself Bob Dylan, a name he borrowed, reimagined, and claimed as his own. Not because he wanted to be someone else, but because he was already becoming someone new. He later said, "You're born with the wrong name, wrong parents. You call yourself what you want to call yourself." For Dylan, names weren't just labels, they were masks, weapons, and shields. The name Bob Dylan would carry him into history, but even then it was clear, he'd never be easily defined. And in the winter of 1961, with barely any money and a guitar case in hand, Dylan made the leap that would change everything. He left Minnesota for New York City, chasing the ghost of his idol, Woody Guthrie. But what he found in the city wasn't just fame, it was friction, pressure, and the first signs that his rise to the top would come with a heavy personal cost. But before the fame, before the headlines, and before the backlash, there was love, and not the fairy tale kind. Next, we explore the twisted emotional relationships that fueled Dylan's most heartbreaking lyrics. If Bob Dylan's songs feel like they know heartbreak a little too well, it's because they do. Dylan's love life was never simple. It was a carousel of passion, betrayal, secrecy, and pain, and each woman who entered his orbit left a mark, whether she was known to the world or hidden in the footnotes of history. It started with Echo Hellstrom, his high school sweetheart. They'd drive around rural Minnesota, listening to distant radio stations that played rhythm and blues, a genre that would shape Dylan's musical DNA. Echo wasn't just a girlfriend, she was his first muse. Some believe she inspired Girl from the North Country, though Dylan never confirmed it. He didn't need to. The longing in that song speaks volumes. Then came Suze Rotolo, the woman frozen in time on the cover of The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Their relationship was passionate, political, and unstable. She introduced him to progressive literature and radical politics, ideas that would bleed into his early protest songs. But their love, like so many of his, burned fast and ended bitterly. When Suze left, Dylan didn't just lose a partner, he lost an anchor. Next was Joan Baez, the queen of folk. They were a power couple in the early 60s, singing side by side, rallying crowds, and reshaping the protest movement. On stage, they were electric. Off stage, things were complicated. Dylan's fame was skyrocketing. Baez was already established. And when their egos clashed, the fallout was swift. Their 1965 breakup, caught in the film Don't Look Back, was as icy as it was inevitable. But the deepest and most private chapter began with Sarah Lowndes, the woman Dylan married in 1965. With Sarah, he seemed to crave normalcy. They had 4 children together, and Dylan adopted her daughter from a previous marriage. For a moment, he played the part of a family man, but fame never let him rest. By 1907, the marriage collapsed under the weight of secrecy, touring, and Dylan's emotional distance. Still, she remained his most elusive muse, immortalized in tracks like Sarah and Idiot Wind, songs so raw they feel like confessions. Yet, even after that, the secrets kept piling up. In 1986, Dylan quietly married Carolyn Dennis, a backup singer. They had a daughter, Desiree, and kept the entire relationship out of the public eye. Nobody even knew about the marriage until a biography exposed it in 2001. It was a classic Dylan move, hiding the truth in plain sight, revealing it only through lyrics, never headlines. His relationships weren't just love stories, they were battlegrounds. And in the wreckage, Dylan built some of the most powerful, soul-bearing music of the 20th century. But love wasn't the only thing that shaped his inner world. Dylan's spiritual journey would prove even more unpredictable and more controversial. Bob Dylan never settled, not in music, not in love, and definitely not in faith. He was born into a tight-knit Jewish family. Bar mitzvahed at 13, he grew up with Hebrew prayers and Old Testament stories echoing through his home in Hibbing. But Dylan was never one to follow rules just because they were written down. Even as a teenager, he questioned everything, including God. Then, in the late 1970s, something strange happened. Dylan, America's countercultural icon, stood on stage and declared himself a born-again Christian. Fans were stunned. The voice of a generation was now singing about Jesus, salvation, and eternal damnation. Songs like Gotta Serve Somebody and Saved divided listeners. Some called it brave, others called it betrayal. Behind the scenes, the shift was even more intense. He joined the Vineyard Fellowship, attended Bible study seminars, and completely rewired his understanding of the world. He wasn't just dabbling, he was all in. For a few years, Dylan performed only gospel music. No classics, no protest songs, just preaching and melody. But then, just as suddenly as it began, he stepped back. By the mid-80s, Dylan distanced himself from the Born Again label, telling interviewers he never used the term and that it was a media fabrication. His beliefs hadn't vanished, they'd evolved. Dylan's faith became private, eclectic, and hard to pin down. He started blending Jewish imagery with Christian themes. He spoke of fate, prophecy, and the presence of a higher power, but never in absolutes. To him, faith wasn't a destination, it was a road, one he kept walking, alone. In later years, he reconnected with Judaism. He attended his son's bar mitzvah. He studied sacred texts. He even showed up on Chabad TV, quietly, almost anonymously. Still, in interviews, he talked about lighting candles in church, reading psalms, praying, not preaching. To this day, Dylan's spiritual life remains a riddle. He doesn't explain it. He lets the music do that. Songs like I Believe in You and Every Grain of Sand aren't just beautiful, they're prayers in disguise. But no spiritual transformation could shield him from what came next. A near-fatal motorcycle crash that would change everything. Or at least, that's what we've been told. July 29th, 1906. Dylan was at the height of his fame, touring non-stop, recording feverishly, and riding a wave of creative momentum that seemed unstoppable. Then, it all screeched to a halt. That morning, near his home in Woodstock, New York, Dylan wrecked his Triumph motorcycle, or at least that's what the story says. Reports claimed he'd fractured vertebrae in his neck. No ambulance was called, no hospital record was released. No official police report ever surfaced, just silence. And that silence only deepened the mystery. Some say the accident was real and nearly fatal. Others believe it was a cover, an excuse for Dylan to step away from the crushing weight of fame. After years of nonstop media attention, invasive fans, and endless pressure to perform, the accident, real or not, gave him the exit he desperately needed. Whatever the truth, Dylan disappeared from the public eye. For months, there were no shows, no new albums, just seclusion, healing, and a reset. When he returned, everything had changed. Gone was the wild-haired firebrand who shouted cryptic poetry into a microphone. In his place was a quieter, more grounded Dylan, one who started recording in Nashville, embracing country sounds and cleaner vocals. His 1967 album John Wesley Harding was sparse, biblical, and introspective. It felt like a retreat from the chaos of the 60s, and fans were left wondering if this was the same man they thought they knew. The crash became legend, a turning point, and maybe that was the point all along. In a world that constantly demanded more from him, Dylan did what only Dylan could do. He vanished and came back as someone else. But before that crash, Dylan had already shaken the foundations of folk music with one electrifying performance that turned fans into enemies and launched one of the most talked about musical rebellions in history. Summer 1965. The Newport Folk Festival was supposed to be a celebration, a homecoming for the genre's golden boy. Dylan had already headlined the event twice, charming crowds with his acoustic ballads and protest songs. But this time, something was different. When he stepped onto the stage that night, he wasn't holding his trusty acoustic guitar. He was strapped with a Fender Stratocaster, backed by a full electric band. As the first notes of Maggie's Farm tore through the speakers, jaws dropped. Then came boos. Some in the crowd claimed it was the poor sound quality. Others said it was the betrayal, the feeling that Dylan had turned his back on the purity of folk music. To many fans, he was no longer one of them. He was a sellout, a traitor. The backlash was swift and brutal. Folk purists like Sing Out magazine's editor, Ewan McCall, slammed Dylan's new sound as 10th-rate drivel. Fans who once worshipped him now accused him of abandoning the movement. But Dylan didn't flinch. In fact, he doubled down. Just days after the Newport incident, he recorded Positively 4th Street, a venomous, sarcastic response to his critics, dripping with bitterness and betrayal. It was a middle finger to the scene that once embraced him, and a warning that Dylan would never be boxed in. That electric set at Newport wasn't just a musical shift, it was a cultural earthquake. It marked the end of one era and the birth of another. From that moment on, Dylan wasn't just a folk singer. He was a force of nature, unpredictable, defiant, and always ahead of the curve. And for better or worse, he was finally in complete control of his destiny. But even after the crash, the controversies, and the reinventions, Dylan's story was far from over. His escape to Malibu would mark a new era, one of isolation, introspection, and quiet transformation. By the late 1970s, Bob Dylan had been to the mountaintop and back, multiple times. He'd shaken the core of American music, ignited protests, baffled critics, and lost himself in the whirlwind of fame. But even legends burn out, and Dylan, always a step ahead, knew he needed to vanish before the myth consumed the man entirely. So, he did what few stars ever do, he stepped back. Far away from the stage lights and screaming fans, Dylan found refuge in Point Doom, an isolated bluff along the Malibu coastline. It was quiet, almost eerily so. Waves crashed against the rocks, palms swayed in the California breeze, and inside his hilltop home, Dylan started rebuilding, not his career, but himself. Malibu wasn't just a retreat, it was a fortress, a place where he could finally be anonymous. No press, no handlers, just vinyl records, dusty books, candlelight, and a man trying to find meaning in the silence. Here, Dylan slowed down. He raised his children in relative secrecy, away from the circus. He read scripture, meditated, and even explored new religious ideas. He walked alone along the beach. Neighbors said he kept to himself, rarely speaking, often seen in the early morning or twilight hours, looking like a figure from another time. But make no mistake, he never stopped working. In the quiet, Dylan wrote some of his most profound late-career songs. Albums like Oh Mercy, Time Out of Mind, Modern Times, and Tempest weren't nostalgic throwbacks. They were cold, clear-eyed reflections on death, loss, faith, and redemption. His voice had changed, harsher, raspier, but somehow it suited the truth he was telling. Time didn't soften Dylan, it deepened him. While his peers faded from relevance or clung to past glories, Dylan stayed vital, reinventing himself yet again, as a grizzled philosopher with nothing left to prove. And yet, he kept touring, kept writing, kept evolving, not because he had to, but because he couldn't stop. Music was never a career for him, it was oxygen. Malibu gave him the distance he needed, but even there, Dylan knew the legend would catch up. The world still had questions, and finally, in his own strange, poetic way, Dylan began to answer them. Because even a ghost, at some point, has to speak. Bob Dylan once said, "A man is a success if he gets up in the morning and goes to bed at night, and in between does what he wants to do." By that measure, Dylan wasn't just successful, he was mythical. But even myths grow old, and in recent years, as the world changed and audiences aged, Dylan's own story entered its final chapters, not with a whisper, but with a roar. In 2020, the world stood still, but Dylan, he was still moving. He released Murder Most Foul, a 17-minute meditative epic about the assassination of JFK. It was unlike anything in mainstream music, a slow, haunted unraveling of American loss and illusion. It wasn't just a song, it was a time capsule, a requiem, and, perhaps most shocking of all, it went straight to one. At 79, Dylan had just scored his first chart-topping single in his entire career. Then came the album Rough and Rowdy Ways, a masterpiece drenched in wisdom, mortality, sarcasm, and soul. Critics hailed it, fans devoured it. New generations discovered a Dylan who wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The album wasn't nostalgic, it was urgent, and it proved something extraordinary. Dylan was still out thinking, out writing, and outlasting almost everyone. But even as the applause returned, Dylan made another headline-grabbing move. In December 20, he sold his entire songwriting catalog to Universal Music for over $300 million. For decades, Dylan had been fiercely protective of his work. So, why now? Some called it a business decision. Others saw it as something deeper, a quiet closing of a chapter, a moment of letting go. Still, Dylan wasn't finished. In 2021, he hosted Dylan at 80, a virtual conference where artists, scholars, and fans explored the impact of his life and lyrics. He streamed Shadow Kingdom, a reimagined performance of his early songs, drenched in noir aesthetics and vintage beauty. Then, in 2022, he released The Philosophy of Modern Song, a chaotic, brilliant book that felt like Dylan's stream of consciousness diary, part satire, part scripture. He embraced technology too. A new format, Ionic Original, was used to release a one-of-a-kind version of Blowin in the Wind, which sold at auction for a fortune. It was vintage Dylan, turning the past into the future. But even amid the accolades, there was an undeniable sense of finality in the air. In interviews, Dylan spoke of eternal judgment, of predestination, of a higher power watching. He lit candles in churches, read psalms, reflected on the afterlife not as an idea, but as something real and near. And through it all, he kept moving, city to city, venue to venue, playing to hushed, reverent crowds who understood that every show might be their last chance to see a living legend. Bob Dylan never tried to be a voice of a generation. He never asked to be worshipped or followed, but somehow, without ever fully letting the world in, he gave it everything he had. And now, as the curtain slowly begins to lower, the question lingers. Who was Bob Dylan really? A prophet? A poet? Or just a man who refused to be anyone but himself? Bob Dylan never asked to be famous. He never courted the spotlight. In fact, he spent most of his life trying to outrun it. The world wanted him to be a prophet, a protester, a poet, a savior. But Dylan was something else, something harder to name. He once said, "All I can do is be me, whoever that is." And maybe that was the clearest glimpse we ever got of the real Bob Dylan. A man in constant motion, never at rest, never fully known. He built a legacy by defying expectations, not meeting them. He sang protest anthems but avoided protests. He rejected the institutions that tried to crown him, even when they came offering Nobel Prizes and Lifetime Achievement Awards. When others leaned into their legend, Dylan pulled back. When fans wanted answers, he gave riddles. When critics tried to analyze his work, he shrugged them off like background noise. And yet, for all his distance, Dylan's music hit closer to the bone than almost anyone else's. Because while he rarely talked about his personal life, he poured it, raw, unfiltered, into his songs. You could hear the heartbreak of lost love in Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. The existential dread in A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall. The eerie quiet of spiritual searching in I Believe in You. Dylan's guitar was his confessional booth. His pen was his shield. He never let us into his world directly, but he left the door cracked, just wide enough for a song to slip through. And that was enough. In a world that demands constant connection, constant explanation, Dylan chose mystery. He chose solitude. He chose to speak only when he had something to say, and then vanish before we could ask what he meant. He lived like a shadow cast in flickering candlelight, always shifting, always just out of reach. And somehow, that made his presence feel even larger. Because Bob Dylan wasn't just a man, he was a signal, broadcasting from some forgotten frequency, picking up static from God, war, death, love, and time itself. He never begged to be heard, but once you heard him, you couldn't turn away. So now we're left with the question, who was Bob Dylan? Not the public figure, not the headlines, not the awards or the controversies, the man. Maybe the answer is that there is no answer. Maybe that's the brilliance of Bob Dylan. He forced us to sit with ambiguity, to live with the discomfort of not knowing, to understand that meaning isn't always obvious or easy. He didn't give us clarity, he gave us mirrors. And in those mirrors we saw ourselves, our confusion, our hopes, our failings, our resistance to being boxed in. That's why his legacy goes beyond music. It's philosophical, spiritual, existential. Bob Dylan didn't just write songs. He carved out a space in American consciousness that no one else could fill. He gave permission to feel deeply, to question authority, to challenge simplicity. And maybe most radically, he showed us that you could spend a lifetime becoming yourself and still not be finished. Even now, Dylan is touring, releasing bootlegs, writing books, whispering truths from the stage, still refusing to explain, still refusing to conform. And maybe that's the most important lesson he ever offered. You don't owe anyone a neat story. You just owe them the truth, even if it's messy, even if it's unfinished. Bob Dylan's life wasn't a straight line. It was a wild, looping path through the unknown, but every step of it mattered. Every twist meant something, even if we'll never fully understand what. And maybe that's the point, because the greatest artists don't just tell us who they are, they challenge us to ask who we are. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more untold stories like this one, and drop a comment. What's the Dylan lyric that hit you the hardest, or the mystery that's still on your mind? Thanks for watching, and remember, you don't have to know the whole truth to feel it, and you don't need all the answers to believe that the signal, however faint, is still out there, waiting to be heard.